Hey guys, I'm Detective Zach Foxen. From CDC warnings to Mexico's cure to crime labs, you're listening to Forensic Geek Radio. Let's get started. Researchers have found that the strain of Bacterium ucerna pestis, or also known as the bubonic plague, festered longer than thought in Europe following the Black Death. From the 14th century to the 16th century, two forms of plague pandemics ravaged European populations, with the peak being during the mid-14th century. That was known as the time during the Black Death. Thanks to DNA research, investigators have found that the bubonic plague continued to affect and be present within the populations well into the 17th century, showing evidence that strains like the plague can linger for a longer time even after the peak in infections. Along the same token of infectious disease, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention announced this week a warning to pregnant women. The CDC has issued a caution of travel to South America and the Caribbean due to a rise in infections of the Zika virus. The Zika virus, which is spread by mosquito vectors, was initially documented in the 1950s within Asia and Africa. Typically presenting a mild sickness of fever, rash, and muscle pain, the virus is communicable by the same malaria-toting mosquitoes and has made its way into the tropical Americas, infecting an estimated 0.5 to 1.3 million patients. The concern for pregnant travelers is due to the link of the Zika virus and birth defects such as microcephaly, which is the abnormally smallness of the head and incomplete brain development. The US and European space agencies launched into orbit the new Jason 3 satellite this weekend. The Jason program tracks oceanic activity such as current activity, sea level, and temperature. Aided into orbit by SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, Jason 3 will also serve as an early warning system for El Niño activity, which we are currently experiencing, as well as we begin mapping the ocean floor using microwave radar for altimeter calibrations. And while SpaceX successfully managed to control a controlled return of a rocket booster last month, the attempt during this launch was not as successful as the booster came in with a little too much force and broke a leg, toppling over. More on the space front is the laboratory production of Plutonium-238. Why is this important? Well, during the Cold War, the Savannah River plant in South Carolina was pumping out Plutonium-238. Those reactors were shut down in 1988, and the United States has not had the capability to make new material since then. See, Plutonium-238 is what powered the Voyager mission along with 30 other space missions, all for the production of the space-grade power source to cease in the late 80s. However, thanks to funding by NASA and the Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy, for the past 2 years, scientists have finally produced 1.8 ounces, or 50 grams, of the radioactive isotope within the Oak Ridge National Labs. This is important because Plutonium-238 has a half-life of 88 years and is very stable, meaning it can power a spacecraft for 88 years before there's a reduction in power. Think of the distances that we can travel within our solar system. See, this is done by the heat generated as Plutonium-238 decays. The next NASA mission, which plans to use such radioisotope power, is the Mars 2020 rover, which is set for launch in July 2020. If you haven't seen the Netflix series Making a Murderer, or HBO's The Jinx, or even listened to the tantalizing NPR podcast Serial, all of these docuseries go back to criminal cases where innocence and guilt were already tried, but seems to be in a gray area. Personally, I really enjoyed the podcast Serial, but I went into it with a particular mindset, and I advise you to do the same. Not taking the series at face value, and I found myself wanting answers to investigative questions I would pose while sitting in the car listening. But the concept of the series is not what I'm talking about today, more so the potential impact on juries. I wonder what these series are having, if any, of impacts. Kin to the claimed CSI effect of the 2000s, where attorneys in the legal system were convinced that every juror watching the CBS series would be an acclaimed armchair scientist, are these series, these new docu-series, making jurors biased towards the defense? Personally, I don't think so. While the CSI effect did show that jurors who watched the series put more expectation into forensic scientists on cases, multiple studies found that ultimately watching shows like CSI or Bones or NCSI did not really affect a juror's decision process within criminal cases. And while most think that the CSI effect was a bad thing, I would argue quite the opposite. It brought public awareness and increased funding to our disciplines, showing the capability of what we can do with science in crime. New series like Making a Murderer or Serial are not necessarily calling into question the forensics of a case so much as they are calling into question the methodology of the criminal justice system, which might not entirely be a bad thing. In past episodes, you've heard me speak about the impact of the 2009 National Science Academy report, Strengthening Forensic Sciences in the United States, A Path Forward. The report gave multiple recommendations on the need to improve the various disciplines from fingerprints to bloodstain interpretation and DNA. But for me, the biggest point that the panel who authored the report tried to make is the separation between the forensics and the prosecution efforts. To remove any chance of corruption or bias by the forensic practitioners working directly with or for the law enforcement agency or the district attorney's office, and went as far as to call for the removal of all public forensic services from the rule of law enforcement and prosecutors' offices. While I understand this concept and partially agree with it amidst various stories of wrongful convictions or tainted forensics, it's far easier said than accomplished. Within the United States, few agencies and few states have enacted successful legislation or policies and procedures removing the oversight of crime labs by law enforcement agencies, with only Houston being a good example. And while DC Metro opened a $220 million claimed state-of-the-art consolidated forensics lab a few years ago under the purview of the Department of Health, that lab has since been plagued with outdated technology, inadequate training for staff, and accreditation scandal. Once again, the public/private Houston Forensic Science Center, which is publicly funded but managed by a private board, provides an example of how the NAS recommendations work. However, the Houston's lab is still within its infancy. To give better insight of how a laboratory functioning in an independent setting thrives, we must look south of the border. In an in-depth article entitled Tainted Evidence, Mexico's Surprising Answer to Crime Lab Corruption, web writer Megan Walsh gives a first-hand witness account of the Instituto Jalisciense de Ciencias Forenses, or for those of us who comically try to pronounce Spanish, the Jalisco Institute for Forensic Science. Opening 18 years ago, the 18-year-old organization is a prime example of the worst crime-ridden territories and how a lab can function. The only lab of its kind within the country, the institute operates within the jurisdiction of Guadalajara, providing almost every forensic discipline needed, even cartography. Civilian crime scene investigator teams that work in an interesting shift similar to those of firefighters with 24 on and 48 off, the institute follows the trail which the science takes them, and provides that paper trail to the police and prosecutors regardless of who the trail leads to, not intimidated by the cartel. With the majority of its employees holding PhDs or backgrounds in the sciences, the lab offers advanced degrees to its employees, advanced training, and the separation of pressures from potential corruption within the prosecution's office. In a geographical setting similar to that of a constant war zone due to the narco wars waged by the cartel, the Jalisco Institute is perhaps an example that we should attempt to recreate within our own practices. Check out Ms. Welch's article and the links in the show notes, and I'd love to know what your thoughts on the separation of sciences from policing are. Hit me up on Twitter and let me know. So over the past few weeks, I've had the chance to train one of our new investigators within our unit. And it's kind of helped me remember the basics and go back to thinking in a more simplistic term of how and why I do things. Specifically, I want to talk about fingerprints. Fingerprints are perhaps the majority of what we as crime scene investigators look for in scenes because they're the most readily identifiable and lead producing evidence that we can find within crime scenes. Mainly comprised of amino acids, salts, and oils, there are a variety of different methods that we can use to develop or enhance friction-ridge patterns. But specifically, I want to talk about those oils, because the majority of the time we use carbon-based powder or fingerprint powder. It comes in a variety of different colors: black, gray, white, gold, red, and neon green. I mean, you name the color, there is one of a fingerprint powder sort, mainly because we want to have the best color option for contrast on those background surfaces. But in thinking of that, of why we do something, why are we using powder? It's because we're trying to isolate the oils, whereas iodine or an anhydride might be isolating those amino acids or those salts. I love my fingerprint brush. It is I have quite a few, but my favorite one is a Whisper. We buy it through Tritech Forensics, and the Whisper brush is fantastic. It is a great fiberglass brush that is useful for pretty much all applications that you use in the field. I highly recommend you check them out. A lot of the different other vendors, they have very similar ones. I just so happen to use the Whisper. But it's an awesome brush, and it has yet to fail me unless it gets wet, in which case if it gets wet, then just like any other fingerprint brush, I have a hard time figuring out how to get it de-clumpy where the hairs stick together. We recently tried to figure out a way to save our brushes that got wet by cleaning them with toothbrushes and hair dryers, and that just found to be fiberglass everywhere, which ends up being really, really itchy. Anyways, I would love to know if any of you guys have great solutions or ideas on how to save fingerprint brushes that have been lost in battle. But on that note, I'm Detective Zach Fox, and remember, you can check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and also go to our website, forensicgeek.science. I want to hear what you guys want to hear on the show. If there's an interview you'd like to hear on a specific topic, let me know. Right now, we're in the process of lining up some different interviews for future episodes. You're listening to Forensic Geek Radio. Keep learning.